Welcome. I'm here to show you a few different ways to create and manipulate textures in an N64 style. These could be helpful for modding N64 games or just creating projects that are in that style. There are a few resources out there that already cover this topic, but by using these methods, you might be able to create things that are more akin to a specific art direction. So, for example, here's a texture that I've obtained from online. It's royalty-free, which means I can use it in anything. And it's also seamless, which means that we can tile it and UV map it however we want, and it won't look weird. So the thing about this is that right now, for one, it's a very high resolution. I mean, you typically want to work in resolutions that are 64, 32, 16, maybe 128, and then some composite of those, like maybe 32 by 64. Really depends on the game that you're making the textures for. Your mileage may vary. The second thing is that I can just scale this down. I'll resize it to say, 64 by 64, and I'll use something like bicubic maybe. This is cool, but for one, the detail is like hard to depict, and if you were to apply this, in a level or in any kind of a model sort of regularly, it would really look out of place. This might fit in something like, say, Ocarina of Time, where a lot of their textures are just straight up photo sourced with minimal editing and post. Games in general use a lot of photo sourcing in this era, N64. However, there are certain games that just kind of slapped them in and didn't do too much to sort of have them fit the art style, because maybe the art style that they are going for is sort of more dependent on more realistic photo source textures. However, in games like, say, Banjo-Kazooie, where a lot of it is made from scratch, and when it is photo sourced, it's heavily modified. They might take one photo, and then they might use it in like dozens of different textures and in different manners. They might change the color and add different layers, use it to have this fundamental feeling of kind of realism, and something that looks recognizable as what it's trying to look like. However, for a purpose like I was saying in Banjo-Kazooie, you're going to want to do more to it. Another thing is that typically textures have a limited number of colors in their palette. This drastically saves on the amount of space that it takes in the memory. You usually want to go for like maybe 16, 8, 32, again, base 2 integers. There are times when, you'll have a texture that is entirely paletted. Sometimes you will have textures that have entirely unique colors where each pixel is defined in and of itself and it's not being referenced in an index. However, if you're going for that style, also if you're actually making models for those consoles, typically it's going to be a limited color palette. So let's undo that and let's start from here. So there are a few different types of resampling that you can use when you're downscaling an image. If we drag this down to 64 by 64, which will be a resolution that is pretty applicable generally. This is what bicubic looks like. This is nearest neighbor. You can tell that this is very noisy because it's not doing any kind of sampling of the surrounding pixels. I believe it's just taking the one that's at that scaled up coordinate. Here's bilinear. That's slightly less grainy. This anisotropic, bicubic, and we're back around to the start. It does depend on what program you're using, but these are like kind of the big ones. So the thing about, say bilinear or bicubic is that, or even this one right here, is that, you might look smoother. Okay, that's nice. It's easier on the eyes. However, you might be losing some detail. So there's a bit of a sacrifice you have to make, and it's all based on just your eye, salt to taste. I tend to go with maybe anisotropic for something like this. Now, if we do this, okay, it looks nice. And then if we go ahead and limit the palette, so here I have that image loaded up in GIMP, which is what I typically use for color indexing. Paint.net doesn't have a great function for it, so I just use GIMP. It's free and it's quite easy to use, and it has a lot of functionality as well. So if we go to index, we can use a few different options here. You can even have dithering if you want, but typically something like Banjo-Kazooie didn't use dithering. Certain games did, but it's generally a sort of very obvious stylistic choice. So here we have the number of colors. This is your palette that you'll be defining. Something like 16 is often a safe option. If you are modding an old game, it will be necessary to know what the number of colors that you need to put it to will be. So for this, we can do 16, and that's what it looks like, and I can compare it's pretty mild. With a texture like this, a lot of the colors are the same, it's more or less just sort of a gradient between this color and this light gray with some very mild hue variation. However, like I said earlier, if we just slap this in the game, it'll look fine, but it won't be ideal. So if we go back to paint.net, I'll show you a few parts of a workflow that I use sometimes that just make it look more fitting to art styles of these old games. So one thing that I like to do is you want to up the contrast a bit, because as you can imagine, as you lower the resolution, you're losing a bit of clarity, a bit of detail. And one way to sort of bring that back is by upping the contrast. You already lost data by downscaling it. However, from a visual standpoint, you don't want all these textures in your game that are, low contrast and muddy. You want there to be identifiable shapes that they're looking at, so you want this to look like a cliffside or a collection of rocks. So if we up the contrast, that helps a little bit. Another thing I do, which is quite useful for replicating the style of Banjo-Kazooie, is doing a bit of a blur. And what I do specifically is I do a blur before I do my posterization or my color indexing, my palette limiting. And what this does is it softens the details a little bit. And there's this interesting sort of appearance that it gives when you finally do palette it. And I'll try to show you that in a second. So if we do a bit of a blur, Gaussian blur is perfectly serviceable. We don't want anything too intense because this sort of goes against the whole, wanting to have identifiable shapes thing I was just saying earlier. However, something like this will be probably serviceable. So let's go ahead and just take this for now and go back to GIMP. Let's undo this palette limiting right here. Okay, it's slightly different, a bit easier to read. And if we do image mode index, do it again, you'll see that there are these sort of like soft collections of pixels. It's quite like pillowy in nature. And if we go back and undo the Gaussian blur and do it again, but a little bit more intense this time, maybe 2 is probably as far as I want to go. Undo all this, do it again. You can kind of see what I mean. There are these like sort of veins of pixels that are of a similar color. And it's sort of, if I compare this, say, to the original thing I imported, you can see a bit of, it's hard to describe. Like here, you have this sort of triangular shape, and there's this really rapid threshold between this lighter triangle and this sort of this shadow. It probably is. Whereas here, there's a bit of a gentle gradient. Obviously, this is just what a blurring does, but there's an interesting phenomenon that I see, at least, when you combine the blurring and the posterization. And it just kind of makes it a bit easier to look at. I might go a little bit under 2. These kinds of things it's all dependent on the appearance and the sort of style that is relevant to your case. 1.6 might be a good balance. Let me just redo this. Mode, bam. And there you go. And in the clumps of pixels that are similar, say here, you'll see you start to get these like sort of these shapes. It's an interesting thing to me, at least. Same with the shadows. You have this nice inner, selection of darker pixels, but then as you go out, it's just a nice gentle gradient. It's a bit easier to look at. However, it's still, to me at least, it still reads perfectly fine, as like a rock surface, at least based on the photo source. Something else we can do is messing with the colors. So an interesting thing about, textures in general is that you want a cohesive color palette and sort of the general composition of the perspective that you'll get when you are playing these games. For example, these are all textures from Banjo-Kazooie that I've just selected. This right here, okay, there's a very underlying strong sort of color. If I select all these pixels, if you look at the color, the color wheel, they're all very much in the same ballpark. Slight hue variations. You can see right here in the hue, slight hue variations, slight value variations. However, you have the shadows, but naturally they're going to be, more extreme. But the whole thing has this general colorful appearance, and that colorful appearance is generally centered around one specific color. I guess one way to sort of highlight that would be if I blurred it like very strongly. Okay, there it is. There's sort of the net color that's occurring in this image. And what happens is when you're using photo source textures is that these textures are, from real life. Things in real life, there are high saturation things like, plants and birds and trees and the sky and, things like that. However, generally there's a lot of visual noise For one, that's why we've blurred this to sort of cut it down, and why we've also upped the contrast to sort of isolate collections of detail together, exaggerate them, but we're exaggerating them in sort of a macro way rather than a micro way. One way to sort of, right now this looks all right. If I copy the blurred and indexed version over, this looks pretty good. If I compare this to say this, it's like, okay, it looks pretty, I'm not going to say similar because obviously these are going for different kinds of rock. This is a very sort of clay-based, sort of dirt-based rock, whereas this is like maybe more alpine or something like that. If I were to blur this and show you the sort of average color, okay, it's, it's pretty, there's not a huge difference between the original image and sort of the average color, but the average color is just like a gray. It's an unsaturated, it's highly unsaturated. In fact, it's only 5. So one way we can actually make this texture fit in a more sort of stylized, cartoony, colorful setting is to give it a lot more color. So what you can do this in any image program, is adding a bit of a color layer and messing with the blend mode and messing with the opacity, the amount that it actually affects the underlying layer. This will depend on what kind of setting you're going for. Okay, if you're going for maybe like a cold, icy sort of cliffside, you might go for something that's a bit more brown, maybe also a bit more blue. So if I just fill this right here, okay, a bit of a Persian green, I guess. Lower the opacity, and this will also highly dictate the way it affects the image, is the blend mode. There's a lot to choose from. A lot of these are the same across different image processing programs. Overlay is one that I like to use a lot. It sort of retains the detail, it retains the value, but it just exaggerates the hue generally. So something like this might be, what was the prompt? I said like icy, a little bit darker as well, something like this. And if we just blend it and compare it to, these images, it's like starting to sort of come together, If I go back and undo all the way to the start, before all this processing, obviously we need it to be downscaled. It's a much better comparison. If I go back, and let me just go here again. If I compare this, you can start to see the sort of the discrepancy that you have between these textures, and that they don't really vibe together. But now that we've done this processing, look at this, compare these, it's like, okay, these shadows are a lot more readable. There's a stronger underlying sort of mood to it, this sort of icy blueness to it, and it's also color paletted. So it'll actually function, in the game that you're modding or otherwise. So one thing I want to emphasize is the sort of order of operations that you use when you're doing these edits. The general theme is that you want to do your posterization, your color indexing at the end. Now here I actually sort of broke that, but the reason it sort of worked out in my favor is because all I was doing was some simple sort of linear arithmetic on the whole image. I wasn't picking out colors, doing this to those colors and doing this to the other colors. I wasn't doing my blurring after this. I wasn't doing any brightness or contrast adjusting after this. I wasn't doing any sharpening or anything like that. I was simply just editing the colors. And that's safe to do after your posterization generally. However, if I were to show you what it would look like if I'd done the blurring beforehand, before the posterization, you'll kind of see what I mean. So let's go back. Let's go back before I did all this. And here we go. So this is indexed, this is not. So this right here, and this is before I did the blurring. So let's say I copied this over into GIMP, and I did my color indexing before I did my blurring. Okay, there we go. And then if I did my blurring after this, effect, blur, Gaussian, luckily it actually saves the option you did. Now, well, for one, I've just eliminated the whole reason I did the indexing in the first place, which was to make it functioning, in the game that you're modding. Now I can go back and, okay, well, I guess I can, if I want, I can go and index this again, but it's a bit redundant, isn't it? Now we've just done it twice in the workflow, and the comparison, I mean, it looks all right, but if I compare this, after I did those 2 posterizations, after I did the blurring, after I did the first posterization, if I compare this to doing the blurring first, you'll kind of see what I mean. So if I blur it first, and then I go posterize it like, sort of you're supposed to, at least I think it's ideal to do so. If I go ahead and bring these in, so this one is the sort of optimal version. This is after doing it twice, a bit redundant. You can kind of see like you're just sort of messing with one of the reasons why the blurring and posterization combo looks nice. And so, for example, here, in the correct option, the correct method, you have these sort of chunks of pixels of a similar color, and there's this sort of, I don't know, there's this overall cohesion to it. Whereas if I compare that to this, it starts to sort of interrupt it. Here, okay, now this nice little chunk of darker pixels highlighting this shadow have become just one. And this shape right here has become a lot more boxy. It's a lot more artificial, it's less organic, whereas here is this nice, it's practically a perfect ellipse, it's at like a 30-degree angle, but it's like a perfect shape, just for example. Same with over here, okay, we have this general large collection of similar colors, this sort of backgroundish type thing. It just sort of, I don't know, it's subjective. It is subjective. However, I definitely prefer doing it the other way, especially over here. I mean, here you have this general, okay, generally this whole shape is this color, but then you have these two details of the darker color. Whereas now it's like, it's really been tampered with, everything, you have these like 4 holes of pixels. These nice shadows are now just single pixels. And, maybe there's a use for this, but I haven't found it myself personally. Not to mention it is a bit redundant in the time it takes. If you're making a large game or a large mod or hack and you're going to be doing a lot of image processing, you'd like to, make your workflow as efficient as possible. In general, this can be a little bit tedious, especially when we get to cases where you have to do a lot more particular edits. But with something like this, it was pretty straightforward. We downscaled it, we upped the contrast, then we blurred it, then we posterized it, and then we did a simple sort of color change. Something I didn't mention earlier is that you also generally want to do your contrast adjustment before you do the blurring, because what that does is it sort of influences the blur in an optimal way, in that it allows it to blur these higher contrast selections of color. So here I have the final image that I've made with all the edits that I've shown you, and we can just compare it to the original image. So here we've taken this, this image that's very high detail, it's very high resolution, has a lot of different colors. I mean, there's even a little chunk of moss or something right there that wasn't included. And we've turned it into something that's a lot more fitting to the style. And here I can show you sort of, in a game that has, whether it be bilinear or trilinear like the N64 has, it looks pretty proper in my opinion. Something else we might want to do in terms of image processing for making a mod or game is having image variations. So here, for example, in Banjo-Kazooie, we have this texture from Spiral Mountain, I believe, that has this background of terrain, this sort of craggy, natural-looking rock, and then we have these little borders of color to represent grass. And what these do is it allows the level designers to sort of transition between different types of textures seamlessly. It would look quite crude if you had this, say, this cliffside or this tyrannic platform where you had the side was rock and then the top was grass, and you just had this transition between those two textures. And, a game like Banjo-Kazooie, you can do texture blending to sort of have this gradient between two different textures. It's a bit heavy-handed to do that in every case, So how would we make one of these? Let's say we had that image from before and we wanted to use it in different scenarios with different textures in the vicinity. Or let's say we had a texture, we wanted to use that, but create a variant for our special case. So let's go and find one of those. I'm not going to use this one. Let's take a texture that doesn't have, variants that have those borders, to really highlight how useful this can be. Okay, so let's say we have brick texture or terrain texture, and we want to transition into, say, some grass. Let's say we have like maybe an oasis or something here, or maybe we have sort of an Egyptian sort of block or architecture, and the top has like some moss grown on it. So let's take this, and one way to cut down on the work is by taking a border from a pre-existing texture. Okay, like this. But how do we do that? These two layers are sort of composited together. We don't have the source file of the different of the two different layers. The magic wand, and you want it to be non-contiguous. That way it selects every instance of a color And you also want the tolerance to be 0 because you only want to select the specific colors that you're selecting. At least in paint.net, we can hold down Control and keep adding all the colors that represent these borders. And other than these, small edge cases, we've just selected it. I might, but what we can do is we can select that, copy it, new layer, paste it, and we're done. Except we're not, because for one, we've now added more colors to this image. It had 16 colors, but now we've just added like 7 more. So that's not going to work. And also it looks quite crude, there's these sharp transitions between the colors, and it just... One way to do it is to add a bit of a shadow. I mean, you can imagine if we have these sort of layers of moss over it, there's probably going to be a bit of a shadow that occurs. There's a couple ways. I mean, you could copy the layer and then change the brightness, but it would be a bit too artificial. I mean, it'd be the exact same pixels. It wouldn't really look... So the way I do it is I get a brush, and there's a bit of a smoothness to it. We go on this layer, and I just use solid black, and if we can just sort of start tracing around it, like this. And now, okay, this is a bit too dark. It's a bit too extreme of an appearance, because shadows in general are quite soft. I mean, for example, here you have these shadows representing the depth of the bricks, and these are quite gentle. This sort of However, what we're going to do is we're going to lower the opacity of this layer and make it look all fine and dandy. So we just do this, and you can spend more time on it if you want, but we can start to do, say, darkness, darken, whatever you want to do. And something, you don't want it to be too dark. You don't want to make it look like it's a border, like it's a sort of a line stroke around it. So something like this would be... However, there's one other thing that I like to do, because, like I said, shadows are quite soft, and although these are soft, these lines are soft in and of themselves, they're still very, very distinguished from the rest of the image. So what I also like to do is I take a larger scale brush, something like this. I lower the hardness to make it super smooth, and then I just add a bit of a stroke to the whole thing. And the position at which you do that, you'll just have to kind of fine tune an eyeball. So now, without it, okay, it looks fine, but then when we start to add this, it'll sort of soften the whole shape of the shadow that we've just added. And let's also go ahead and delete this right here, because in this example, I wouldn't be using moss on the ground beside the block, I would just be having moss on top. So it would look something like this. However, we can't just use this as it is, because like I said earlier, there's too many colors, and also the shadow just looks quite crude. For starters, we want to disable this layer, and then we're going to go ahead and merge these all together, because we're isolating the original image and the shadow together. And now let's go ahead and go to GIMP, copy this over, image mode index, make it to 16. Suddenly you can see that the shadow is now, in a sense, it's very heavily incorporated into the original image. And it's only marginally adjusted these details. If we wanted, in fact, I'll do this right now just to make it, you can see that the shadows in the original image have this sort of red hue. So, okay, well, let's redo this process, but with using a bit of a hue, because right now there's not really an easy way to add hue to these layers because they're perfectly black. If there were a slight saturation, we could do some manipulation, but let's just redo it. So let's, just for example, let's color pick this. And let's hide these layers. I'll do the broad stroke just for starters, something like that. Then we can do 3, I think I did. Might do 4 instead. Let's trace along it. Something like that. And then let's change the opacity. What was this at? It was at 120. We go 120, and then this was at like so, and boom, that already looks a lot more fitting, doesn't it? So let's just delete these, we don't need them anymore. Let's combine these layers, redo this process, image mode, index 16. I mean, look at that, it didn't even adjust the colors of the main image at all. When I compare, and these shadows, they're nicely incorporated into the image, and we can go back and paste this here. So now we have a version of this underlying layer. Now we have, okay, the background's paletted, it's 16 colors, but what about the grass? Okay, well, it's not. So there's a couple ways to do this. You could go ahead, combine all the layers, go back in and posterize it like so. And I mean, this looks all right. But in certain cases, if you have any color in the rest of the image that is close to the color of the border that you've added, it'll sort of interfere with that. Like, let's say there was a bit of a greenish hue to some of these details. Do I soften these more intense colors to fit with the color in the rest of the image, or do we exaggerate the other colors to fit with this right here? So what I do is I just eliminate that decision making completely that it has to make, and I just posterize them separately. So let's go back to this, and instead of doing 16, and we can sort of work backwards. So right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in my opinion, a lot of these are redundant. So let's go ahead and simplify that. So you'll find in cases like this, you might want to do very hands-on edits. You can't always do these broad strokes of like, oh, changing the saturation and the brightness and adding different layers. Sometimes you do have to go pixel by pixel, but for the most part, it should be. So this looks all right. I almost want to simplify it a little bit more like that. So all we're doing here is we're sort of we're staging the posterization to have an easier time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 is not bad. Oh, let's get rid of these two. So that's 5 colors. Let's copy this layer over. And what we can do is we can just posterize. I mean, we already know that this is posterized. We've just confirmed it by selecting the individual colors. But if you really wanted to, you could go and paste it in GIMP and do that. That's fewer. So, okay, we had 5 colors in the overlay. So we're going to want 11 colors in this instead. Let's do 11. And there you go. And I mean, this is a pretty gentle. You're losing a little bit of detail, but for all intents and purposes, it's identical. And ultimately, there's no avoiding the loss in detail when you start adding different layers of different colors. So let's copy this over right here. Truly, we have a functioning texture. This has 16 colors, and we can double check by going in. We can check our work, image, mode, index, 6. And then if I copy this over what we did, you should see no difference. And in fact, you don't. I'm undoing and redoing the copying and pasting of this version right here, and there's no difference. So if you do everything right, you shouldn't need to check it because you've already ensured through the individual layers that a total of colors that ends up being the number of colors that you want. In this case, it's 16. And you can even compare, these two images, and you can see that there's a shadow here on this other texture, and this sort of replicates that. It's spread a lot more to the rest of the texture, but this is because we're talking about a surface, this cliffside, that has a lot more variation than a man-made, brick surface. One last thing that you might want to do in terms of creating textures is creating a set of textures that can be tiled together. Having one single seamless texture that you can just spread across the whole surface is great. However, when you're having large collections of polygons that share the same texture, the same appearance, say like the ground or maybe a large cliffside that has different segments, having one texture that repeats many times over starts to look a bit repetitive, and a player might even be able to tell that it's just the same pattern over and over again. So one technique you can do is to have 4, 6, 8, it really doesn't matter, just any number of textures that you sort of pull from whenever you're creating a large surface. You simply apply each texture to each surface individually, and what it'll create is this large composite. You have this one texture that's made out of many textures. However, the great part is that you can arrange it however you want and allow a surface to have a not so obviously repeating pattern to it. So let's do that. Here we have a new texture. This is photo sourced like the first one. And you might be wondering, well, how do we create all these different variations from one texture? So in the one example, we took the whole image, scaled it all the way down, and then that became our one image. But for something like this, we're going to want to take, at least in this case, I'm going to take 4 different parts of it. The key is that you want each part to be different and unique. That way, when you combine them together in your model, there won't be so much repetition. So let's go ahead and scale this down, and let's assume that each individual texture will be 64 by 64. So then this whole thing will be 128 by 128. That way we have 4 64 by 64 textures. Let's use anisotropic like we did the other time. A lot of this will be familiar compared to that other process because it'll go in a similar manner because again, we're using a photo source texture. So let's take this, now we have this large 128 by 128 image, and let's copy it over to a new canvas. So the first thing we're gonna have to realize is that, okay, you can tell that these 4 sort of sub-images connect perfectly along these segments. However, you won't always be having these images in this arrangement. You know, that otherwise it would be defeating the whole purpose of splitting them up. So for example, if I had, say, this 64 by 64 segment, and it was instead, you know, beside the one that will be on the bottom right, you can kind of see that it won't really line up. Same if I put it over here, it won't exactly line up with this. I mean, this is pretty glaringly obvious. There's an obvious line there. So what we want to do is have this variation like we do, you know, that's pertinent. But when it transitions to the side of the texture, all 4 edges need to become something that is the same between all 4 images. So the easiest way to do that is to take the original image, which is seamless, and scale it down to 64 by 64. And we're going to use both the large scale 2 by 2 grid and just the original texture in and of itself. So here, if I go ahead and paste this 4 times, so now we've taken this whole image, which is the same as this, but it'll be half as large. And we're just going to copy this because this will always be seamless, no matter the arrangement, because it's simply the exact same shape. Unless you're rotating the texture, but I wouldn't recommend that because you're already going to have a lot of variation just with these 4. You're going to have a lot of different combinations that you can arrange them in. So here we have this whole thing, and this is seamless, but this is not. So what we'll do is we'll start deleting the edge of the whole thing. That way the underlying reliable repeating pattern will shine through. So here I've just created a little guide for us. That way we can do things pretty accurately. So if I get the eraser out and I just hide this, what we're going to do is we're going to erase on these lines just like this. So let's do that. It could be a little tedious. Right now I'm using a mouse. A stylus would be ideal. And there would also be a way to do it just say using the gradient tool in whatever software you're using, but this is perfectly fine. And if anything, it'll add just a bit more sort of organic nature to it. So now what we have is a collection of unique images in and of themselves. However, what you can see is that this underlying thing allows them to tile perfectly. And if I were to arrange these in different orientations, you'd be able to see that they're perfectly compatible no matter the arrangement that you put the 4 images in. So next, we want to do sort of what we did in the other one, where we want to make it look, you know, stylistic and fitting of whatever game we're working on. So let's merge these together, although I also want to retain the original layers just in case I need them. And we're going to do the brightness contrast. It's a little much, isn't it? Let's do something like that, maybe. We're going to do a bit of a blur. That should be good. So now this is nicely blurred, but let's do a bit of a color infusion with it. Let's take a nice sort of brown color. Let's make it like a nice earthy color. Let's do overlay again. I want to do it a bit more subtly, but in turn we'll have to darken this and saturate it a little bit. Compensate, because if we do it too far, you can see that the slight hue variations, like in this, you know, this is a bit more yellowish. It's not just, I'll show you here, it's not, you know, you can see that this is a bit more unsaturated and this is more strongly saturated towards yellow. We want to try and retain that because we don't want the whole thing just to be on a simple like color grade, you know, from a light version of it to a dark version. We want different hue variations. So that's pretty good right there. I might do that and then I might exaggerate the saturation just a little bit. There we go. I might do a bit of another blur ever so slightly. There you go. And now let's try and see what it looks like when we posterize it. Looks pretty great to me. Let's go ahead and bring this over. And all we have to do now is just separate them. Probably a better way of doing this into each individual image. And I'm just looking at the selection size on the bottom left, but this will depend on the software that you're using. And now we have our individual textures. They're posterized and they look pretty nice. And I can even show you the whole reason why we did this whole process by arranging them in any other arrangement than the original that we had. So this was the top left one. So let's put it here. And we just want to more or less just want to scramble these around just to show what I mean. This was the bottom left one, but now it's top left. This is bottom, and this can just stay bottom right. So what you can see, if I just copy this over and compare it to the final, you can see that they're still seamless because you can tell that this little part right here, the edges of the textures are complementary. They're the exact same. And so you'll have no problem tiling these in any way that you want.